well, we were going to talk about some law and policy as it relates to achieving the Ngor commitments and the Sustainable Development Goals. Give us 1 second. I think our presentation. Great. So today we're going to be talking about the enabling environment for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals as well as the Ngor commitments. My name is Alexandra Campbell-Ferrari. I serve as the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. We are a small nonprofit in Washington, D.C. focused on understanding, evaluating, and innovating in water law and policy. And for us, water law very much includes sanitation law and policy, which is what will be the focus of our conversations today. My colleague here is Luke Wilson. He is the fellow co-founder and deputy director, so we'll be leading this conversation and session today. So welcome and thanks for joining us. The roadmap for today, just so you have a sense as to what we're going to be talking about, we're going to start with what is law. Essentially giving you some ideas about what the basics are, what we mean when we talk about law. The second thing we're going to talk about is specifically what is sanitation law, and that is specific to the sector. The third thing is we're going to talk about where and how the SDGs and Ngor commitments fit in to law and sanitation law. And then the last thing is we'll just give you a little bit of a sense as to our initiatives and how we're working to advance the achievement of the SDGs and Ngor commitments through law and policy in case you're interested in working with us or you have further questions. So I'd like to formally introduce my colleague Luke, who will be giving us a sense as to what is law. Do you want well, I can talk about it with you.
Hello. So first, and hopefully we can have this be a conversation between us and you. Are there any lawyers in the room? That's good. I can say whatever I want then. So part of what we wanted to do is to set a bit of a foundation for the conversation that we're going to have, to give us somewhat of a shared vocabulary as we go forward. But in particular, when we're talking about what is law, we wanted to sort of get that framework and get the components of the law built into this discussion before we get into how they're being used in the Ngor commitments, in the SDGs, and then in sanitation law and the specific sectoral aspect that we're going to be talking about. So, I guess the first part is to talk about the very fundamental components of the law. Where does law start from? And to a certain extent, there is an interplay between policy and law that exists. So, you have this sort of legal hierarchy that we've set out in this first column. But there's also policy aspects and policy inputs that are built into this. Before you write a constitution, and the constitution is going to be that fundamental document that guides how the government works, that guides what powers are allocated and what rights are allocated to the people, you need to have a sense almost from a policy background of what you want to achieve in your new country, in your government. So there is, in many ways, even for a constitution, there's a policy background. We want to have equity. We want to have water for all. We want to have sanitation for all. If you decide that those are policy goals that you have, then you use your constitution to articulate how those powers, how those rights exist in the law. But what happens is that when you write the Constitution, then you have to start creating law. Now, the Constitution will allocate some of the authority. It will create the powers in the executive, in the presidency, for example, or in different ministries. It'll create a legislature, oftentimes, in most countries, that have a lawmaking function. And it will also create, oftentimes, a judiciary, a court system that serves as an implementer, as an enforcer of the law to a certain extent, serving that interpretive role, serving that role, making sure that the law is being applied faithfully. So once it creates those powers and creates those bodies, it will start to allocate the powers between them. But even so, once you have those powers, those authorities, you then need to have, again, another discussion. We have our Constitution. We have this, let's say that we built a right to water, a right to sanitation into our Constitution. Well, now when you're thinking about the lawmaking process, you have to think who should have the authority? Who should have the role in setting these standards and in defining what that means, what that right to sanitation includes? And so the right to sanitation may be very clearly stated in the Constitution, but in reality, there's a lot of components to it that need to be articulated in the law as well. Access. Does everybody get the exact same type of sanitation? Can you have on-site sanitation? Can you have non-sewered sanitation, or does everything have to be sewered? These are the aspects which may not be clear in a constitutional directive, but that you need to set through law otherwise. So then you can get into the legislation and regulation. Now, oftentimes legislation is where you have the government setting those foundational, you have your constitutional language, and you say, okay, well, when we address this in the law, we want to discuss issues of access, and we want to discuss issues of the different types of sanitation. So that sort of policy background, so now we've sort of leapfrogged, that is now going to be expressed through legislation. Now that legislation or that lawmaking can take a variety of different forms, and sometimes it's legislation in a Congress or in a parliament, and sometimes it is legislation or lawmaking in the executive, by ministries, by presidential decree. So those are aspects of the lawmaking process. But the Constitution still exists. It still has a role. It still limits the powers of each of these lawmaking bodies. So there is still this limiter. The Constitution will say the president can do this, but he can't do that. The legislature can do this, but it can't do that. So even when you get to that next step, that next policy-making step, where you're saying we want to discuss access in our law, we want to discuss the different types of technologies and options that are available, you still have the limits that are set based on the powers that each of those actors has. So when you get in, so now we say we want access, we want to discuss access, we want to discuss the different types of sanitation. So then you have legislation. That legislation will lay out oftentimes a broad framework. And then you'll have another line. You'll say, okay, well, here we have this legislation that says we're going to allow expressly for on-site sanitation, for non-sewered sanitation. And those are big ideas. They have a lot of components to it, and they need additional implementation guidelines. And a lot of times that's what you see in the regulations as well. But these, primarily these first three aspects, create binding law, mandatory law, things that have to be followed by the government and by the people. But a lot of times governments want to set a vision, want to set priorities, want to set where they want to go, and to have a sort of more of a vision for how sanitation is going to evolve. So even though they have this binding law, which may be fairly clear, oftentimes there's a view of how do we move it into the next step. And so there's a policy-making process, policies, strategies, plans, oftentimes, which also have this role. They aren't necessarily binding on the government or binding on the people. They aren't mandatory to be followed. But they create that vision. They create that pathway so that people can see, okay, well, as we're looking at these laws and regulations, the Constitution says we have a right to sanitation. The legislation says we will provide access, and we will allow for on-site sanitation and non-sewered sanitation. And the regulations make that clear, that it's VIPs or it's cartridge toilets. It gives us the actual definition of what that means. Then you have these policies and strategies and plans which say, okay, and here's how we're going to develop, here's how we're going to move into the next generation. Here's how we're going to deploy these technologies. Not necessarily creating it firmly in stone, like we're going to put 3 VIPs here. We're going to put 8 cartridge toilets here. We're going to create, we're going to have an emptier's guild that we're building. The law won't necessarily have that. It won't create that mandate, but policies and strategies and plans will have that as part of the vision and how these things are going to be implemented. But they aren't necessarily going to be something that can create full accountability for the government or for the people. But they do create that pathway, that way forward, and allow people to see here's how the law is intended to apply. But some of the ways, when we're talking about how law works, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague to add some additional color. As we're talking about how the law works, the terms in the right column really highlight some of the aspects of the law and the language and how important the language is in the law that helps to signal what those authorities are. And we'll come back to this when we talk a little bit about the Ngor commitments and the SDGs. But at the very top, again, sort of as we did here on the left column, this is a hierarchy. The Constitution is the highest document, then legislation, then regulations, then policy, strategy, plan. There's a hierarchy in there. Constitution is the most foundational. It's the for most countries, it can never be violated. Legislation is subject to the Constitution. And then regulations are subject to legislation. Policies are subject to regulation, which is subject to legislation, which is subject. So there is a hierarchy here. And on the other side, there is also a bit of a hierarchy built in to these terms. When you see the words shall and must, those are mandatory words. Those are words that say this is something that cannot be violated. This is something that has to be followed, must be followed, shall be followed. Conversely, may and can, that's more permissive language. You can do something. It gives that power, it gives the option to take an action, but it doesn't require that action. Should is a lot more like may and can. Should has this, you should do something. There is an element of this is the best course, but it's still more permissive language. So like may and can, you may. It gives you the option. You should do this, but you don't have to. So usually there's a caveat. Usually there's an exception. Now I'll say the next four words that are included: undertake, ensure, support, and enable. These are where it gets a little bit trickier. These words, depending on where you are, what type of legal system you're dealing with, even what country you're in. And I'll admit that the French translations or the Portuguese translations or the Arabic translations may also have this, they may not have the same definitions as they do in English. But these four words can have different meanings depending on where you are, in what legal system you're working inside. So undertake, I can tell you, and I'll talk about this more when we get to the Ngor commitments, but undertake is much more of a mandatory word on the international level, but in domestic systems, undertake often has more of a permissive tone. So on the international level, if you're dealing with a treaty or you're dealing with an international commitment, undertake typically means shall and must at the international level, but in the domestic system, undertake can be more permissive, may and can. Ensure, may and can. Support, that's very much a may and can. We will support something. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have to do something. And enable, it's the same idea. Enable, in the enabling environment, it's creating a foundation, but it allows a lot of interpretation. How do you support something? How do you ensure something? How do you enable something? These are terms which allow for interpretation, allow for different types of policies, strategies, and plans in order to actually implement these goals. So, you want to add anything? No. All right.
So that helps to give you a sense as to generally what law is and what we're talking about when we talk about law. So it covers everything. It essentially, the idea behind the term law and the way that you should conceive of the term law is that it covers every mechanism that impacts or influences the way in which we are managing or providing sanitation services. And so here, we're here to talk about sanitation, so it's important for us to narrow this back into sanitation. And so here we talk about what is sanitation law. Now, the way that I've laid this out is to give you a sense as to kind of some of the larger principles that govern sanitation and where you might find that laws or policies or plans or strategies or regulations are actually acting or are conveying sanitation ideas. So one of the ways that you might see, and I will actually provide an example through one country context, but one of these principles is that you want human waste to be safely managed along the sanitation value chain. So in terms of when you're looking at laws and policies and all these different mechanisms, you want to look for how this principle is being conveyed. And it could be conveyed in a larger policy statement, like we should manage sanitation across the sanitation value chain. It could be something very simple. Or it might say, here's how we're going to manage sanitation along the sanitation value chain. We are going to govern transportation, and here are the basic principles that govern transportation. Here's how we're going to value or to regulate reuse. Here are the standards that you have to meet if you're going to reuse a safe fecal sludge. The second is comprehensive planning and sustainable financing. So this is another really broad category, but again, when you're looking through laws and policies and strategies and you're trying to get a sense in terms of what existing mechanisms, legal mechanisms, are currently governing sanitation, this is a broader category, but you'd be looking for mentions of cost recovery. You'd be looking for discussions about tariffing and what is said about tariffing. You'd be looking for any kind of planning mechanism. So what kind of plan are you required to have when it comes to safely managing across the sanitation value chain? What does that look like? In terms of inclusive and equitable sanitation for all, this is another really broad category, but the idea is that the basic principle is quite large, but when you're looking for something within these different mechanisms, you'd be looking for something that mentions gender. And maybe a regulation might require that any water or sanitation board would have 50% composition of women. That's a very concrete nod to an inclusive and equitable sanitation for all. Or that in planning for your sanitation technology, that it must take into consideration the needs of disabled people, or of women, or of people of different religions that have different needs. So that is something, those are kind of the policy statements that you might find. Or you might find a very specific regulation that governs equitable sanitation. Like I said, it might say that the composition of a sanitation board or a water board that governs sanitation has to be 50% women. Technologically agnostic. So a lot of times you'll see policies that say and prescribe the specific technology that has to be adopted. It's preferable if we talk more about the standards that govern. So this is where the role of regulation comes in. We want regulations to say, here are the standards that the technology that you're using have to meet. Because it's not about the technology in so much as that it is about what is being achieved. So what is the technology that you're trying to use with respect to sanitation? What is the point of it? And the point of it is everything else that we've talked about, right? It's about equitable sanitation. It's about safely managing it across the sanitation value chain. So it's about the endpoint. It's not necessarily about the technology. So the policies, you're hopefully going to find a more agnostic approach where it talks more about the standards that govern the provision of sanitation, but most likely you might find that a policy specifically prescribes what kind of sanitation technologies have to be used. Or they might prescribe a specific minimum. It might say at least a VIP has to be used, or a pit latrine cannot be used, or a cartridge, a bucket system cannot be used. And we have seen that in certain contexts. The last policy that I would say in terms of when you're looking at these existing legal mechanisms that you're trying to look for is the governance and institutional framework. So Luke talked a lot about how important and the role that constitutions and legislation play in creating that institutional framework. And that's where you're going to find out who has responsibility for providing these services and for overseeing them. So for instance, the Constitution may say, it is the national government's responsibility to provide these services, or it is the national government's responsibility to determine who provides these services. So it could prescribe that it is the national government, and therefore you have a very centralized approach, or it might say it's up to the national government, the legislature, or the specific regulatory body, so the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Water and Sanitation, to decide who is to provide or oversee the provision of these services. But you'd be looking in the Constitution, you would be looking in the law, you'd be looking in your policies and your regulations to determine who is responsible for that. So that's just a general, in terms of trying to focus in and thinking about law, and then focusing in terms of what are we talking about when we're talking about sanitation law, and where would you find anything that talks about sanitation. And the reason that we did this is because oftentimes anything that governs sanitation may or may not be in the national sanitation policy. A country may or may not have a national sanitation policy. It may not have a law specifically governing sanitation. It may have a National Water Act, or it may have a law that governs water and at least gives some kind of nod to sanitation. So it's important to think broader about sanitation. So for instance, you might even look in a development plan, a community development plan, to find information about sanitation. And so thinking about it in terms of the principles and the existing legal mechanisms that countries might use is the way in which you'd be able to determine how existing laws effectively govern or do not govern the management and provision of sanitation services. So one of the examples that I will talk through is, since we are in South Africa, I thought I'd go through the South African example. So we start with the Constitution. It says very simply, everyone has the right to access sufficient food and water. They don't have necessarily, and they don't talk about in their Constitution, sanitation. But where it does come out is in one of their early 1994 white papers. So they have a white paper, and you can see the language that we were talking about. You can see how different the language will be from Constitution to policy to regulation, and I will try to point those out, but be sure to be looking for those. So if I go back to the Constitution, everyone has a right to have access to. So it has created a right. And when it's a constitutional right, it is one of the most important rights. It is a very protected right in terms of this legal hierarchy that we're talking about. The white paper is more of a policy statement. So the government is trying to determine what is its vision for providing sanitation. So it starts out that development should be demand-driven and community-based. So there's that language, should. Basic services are a human right. Now, this is more of a determinative statement, but it has to put it into a document that is enforceable. So policy can lay out what should exist or what they recognize as a human right. But until you put that in an enforceable document, it is not necessarily enforceable against the government. So here is some for all rather than all for some. Again, this is a policy statement, the idea that there should be some basic level of sanitation service available to everyone instead of the best sanitation service only available to some. That's a policy statement. That's a vision statement on how the country is going to move forward with providing these services. Okay. So then we get the Water Services Act, which is a piece of law. It's a law that's been passed by the legislature. And here's where you start to see some of those rights fleshed out. So here, the Constitution said everyone has a right to water, and that's not necessarily clear. What does that mean? What is the scope of that responsibility that the government has? What is the scope of that right? Here's where they start to define what that means, and they say that everyone has a right of access to basic water supply and basic sanitation. And you can start to connect the dots, so that some for all and all for some is coming through this statement. It's essentially saying, everyone has the right to water supply, and now they're even prescribing a right to sanitation, which is different than what the Constitution sets out, and it's saying a basic water supply and basic sanitation. It's going in so far as to say that everyone has a duty to provide access to water services. So this is, I'm talking both about water and sanitation, but again, the language is that there is a duty, there is a responsibility. It is creating a responsibility on the part of the government to actually provide these services. So now, through the law, we have a clear example of the standard of service that we're expecting, so it's a basic sanitation, and then we'll also have a sense as to who is supposed to provide that. So the government, the Water Services Authority, and that is defined in the law, and it can be the government at it's at the local level, has a duty to provide these services to its customers. So that's an example of the law. Now we have a policy, and this is a further development of that white paper, but it's several years later. It's 2016, so almost 20 years later, they've re-envisioned this, and this is based on their implementation of their Water Services Act. And so they talk about their policy is much more developed because they've now had 20 years to think about it, and also 20 years to see what is missing and how the law doesn't necessarily address certain aspects. So they talk about the costs associated with ongoing operations. They talk about the specific needs of women and the vulnerable must be considered in sanitation services provision. We didn't necessarily see that in the other documents. Providing physical access to sanitation is essential for safety and dignity of women and girls. So you see certain themes come out, and you see how the policy is there to say, okay, this is where the law didn't necessarily act. There's a gap in what exists in the law, and we are recognizing that there's a need that we need to meet. So let's provide what that vision is, and then we'll put it into a new law, which they haven't necessarily done yet, but it's in their policy. So this now guides how people are implementing the law, even if it's not necessarily stipulated in the law. And in 2017, the Ministry of Water and Environment set out these norms and standards. So this is regulation. This is that intermediary between a law and a policy. These are specific standards that are adopted. So for instance, sanitation services shall not cause contamination of surface water, groundwater, or coastal water. So here they're specifically saying if you provide sanitation services, the goal is that it cannot contaminate the surrounding environment. It cannot contaminate the surrounding water resources. So that is a goal. And the way that they're going to achieve that in the sanitation area is to elevate your toilets, to make sure that if you are in a flood-prone area, that when there is a flood, your sanitation services do not create an issue. And I'm speaking more of non-sewered sanitation. The environment is free from human feces. So they have specifically that all excretia disposal shall protect surface water. Again, they're really emphasizing the impact that sanitation can have on the environment. So they've realized that there's this interplay between sanitation and the environment and the broader water resources, and they're trying to create goals and specific steps that water service providers and others can take to achieve that. So why did I go through that? In essence, it's an example of how law and policy develop in tandem. So I'm using law in two ways, but it's essentially how legislation, regulation, policy, plans, and strategies all develop, and they shift and they move, and it doesn't necessarily mean that one is then revised just because a new policy has come up. So the way that it's typically seen is that the policies and the regulations help to implement your piece of legislation. And at times, those laws will then be revised several years later to reflect the new policies and to reflect the new regulations, but other times they're just used as a way to understand that piece of legislation in 30 years after it was written, so that it is implemented in today's times and under today's understandings. Do you have anything to add? So before we jump into this, I don't know if, Luke, you wanted to say anything?
Well, I wanted to say, are there any, so we've sort of tried to lay a foundation here, again, so that we could all have the same vocabulary and start from the same place. But are there questions from the audience of things that having seen this, that we can address before we move into talking more about the enabling environment specifically? Nobody wants to be that student. Okay, I see a hand in the back.
We can't necessarily see that far.
You can shout. I'll listen.
It was a very good.
Try now. Yeah.
It was a very good presentation. I think you didn't talk about the rules of business, which often help the government departments who are working with these policies, acts, and laws to enforce them. But those, like, as far as I'm from Pakistan, and we have seen that enabling environment and removing the confusions of the roles and responsibilities between the departments. So who is the department responsible for enforcement of a certain legislative instrument then becomes very clear. I just wanted to mention.
So with respect to enforcement, that is also dictated in your laws or your constitution. So typically, and it may not be. So we're talking, and you'll notice that I use the language should. Oftentimes there are examples where that authority is clearly allocated to a specific ministry. In other instances, it's unclear as to who is responsible for enforcing what provisions. In some instances, especially if it's a regulation that has been issued by an agency or like a Ministry of Environment or Water, it would be the ministry itself who is responsible for ensuring that there's enforcement or compliance. If that is an authority that they have further devolved down, which is typically what happens in the sanitation area and in water supply, then it would be the responsibility of the local municipalities or the counties or the states, depending on how local you get, to enforce those and ensure compliance, because they themselves are the ones to which you would apply for a permit. So let's say you have to have a permit to create a sanitation, a publicly operated treatment facility, a larger centralized system, wastewater treatment plant. Then that might be the locality, not the national government, that issues the permit, and then that locality would be responsible for ensuring compliance. But all of that is set forth in the law itself, or it should be.
I'll also say, policies, plans, and strategies help to clarify what the laws and constitution and regulations set out. So I think the example from South Africa, you saw that there were basic rules that were included in the Constitution and in the Water Services Act that were then clarified through the policy prescriptions that the government put out. So there is this back and forth. The policies are more malleable, oftentimes, or more flexible. It's a current interpretation, one that doesn't necessarily need to go through a legislative or lawmaking process in order to be changed. So it has a little bit more flexibility. But it is, in some cases, and I think in South Africa this is true, it does provide a fairly authoritative interpretation of what the law is supposed to mean, what the actual legal provisions are supposed to mean. So even though you have these rules that are being set by the ministries, set more internally through policy prescriptions, they can sometimes be used to say this is what you interpreted the law to mean, and to create an accountability mechanism there. But they themselves may not be as binding in terms of law as the actual basic law or constitutional authorities itself themselves. Are there other questions? I think I saw. Okay.
Je vais parler en français. Merci bien. Moi, c'est Drissa Traoré du Mali. J'ai écouté avec attention les exposés. J'ai deux petites questions. La première, quel est le rôle, comment est-ce que les engagements internationaux sont pris dans l'élaboration d'une loi? En compte quoi? Aussi, une chose est d'élaborer une loi, une autre chose est l'application de cette loi. Je voulais savoir ici, quelles sont les difficultés que vous rencontrez, en tout cas dans l'application des lois que vous avez dites là, il y a une série de lois. Donc, je voulais avoir des informations. Merci.
So absolutely fantastic questions. The first one we are actually going to get to. So the first question we will answer in the next half of the presentation. Sure. So the first question was asking how do international commitments play into national law, and what is the role of that? And so we will talk about that as part of the enabling environment in the second half. The second question had to do with, I've now forgotten, but it has to do more with the enforcement, I believe. Okay, so the enforcement of this, and we will also talk about that in the second half of the conversation. But if we don't answer it in the second half, please keep us honest, and feel free to repeat your question. So I think with that, because of that question, don't worry, we will have more time for questions, I promise. But I think we're going to jump into the next half because this is also a participatory part. So we want to take 2 minutes. A lot of you were handed out sticky notes. And if you didn't receive sticky notes, just look to your friend that's next door. But what we want you to write on it, and then you can come and hand it to one of us, is what does an enabling environment for the SDGs and Ngor commitments mean to you? So what is an enabling environment specific to SDGs and the Ngor commitments? What does that mean to you? What do you understand that to say? So we'll take 2 minutes to just give you some time to think about it, and then feel free, we'll come and collect them.